Hello, everyone, and welcome to Field Notes. My name is Paul Reich, and I am the producer of the Field Notes webinar series. As part of the review committee, we solicit and select topics for each webinar. We do have one exciting topic for you today, but let's first go over a few housekeeping items. This is a Microsoft Live event, not a Teams meeting, which means you are joining today's webinar in listen-only mode. We encourage you to ask questions at any time using the Q&A panel. The Q&A panel should open by default. However, if for some reason your Q&A panel is not open, simply click on the question mark icon located in the upper right side of your screen. For closed captions, turn on the live caption button located in the lower right corner. Today's session is being recorded. Recorded sessions are available in Teams, on the Field Notes channel, and the Soil and Plant Science Division's YouTube channel. Again, thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed today's session. With that, I'd like to turn it over to the Field Notes moderator, Deb Harms, to tell you a little more about today's webinar. Take it away, Deb.
Thank you very much. Oops, I went too far. But just to start off, I want you to just save the date for the next webinar is the day before Valentine's. So please join us then. Now I'll go back to the introduction, if my mouse will let me. Okay, today's talk is an introduction to the Ecological Sites Analytical tool. It's going to be given by Andrew Brown of California, and I'd like to give a little brief overview of Andrew. Andrew grew up in Connecticut and studied environmental science with a concentration in soil science at the University of Connecticut. He started his career with NRCS as a temporary student intern in the Connecticut State Office, MLRA, Soil Survey Office in Tallinn, Connecticut in 2012. At UConn, he lived and worked at the student farm, worked for the UConn Plant Science Research Farm and Soil Nutrient Analysis Laboratory as a research assistant, as well as worked as a computer programmer in a computational genomics laboratory focused on conifers. In 2014, Andrew moved to Davis, California, where he studied in the Soils and Biogeochemistry graduate group. In 2016, he moved to the Sierra Nevada foothills for his dream job, working on initial soil surveys out of the Soil Survey Office in Sonora, California. In the last 8 years, he has been involved in the completion of the Cavarias and Tulum counties, the Central Sierra foothills, and initial soil survey in 2018. He did project updates in Mariposa County in 2019 and 2020, as well as assisted with the Sequoia Kings Canyon National Park initial soil survey, which was completed in 2021. Andrew is still in the Sonora area today. Currently, he is the project leader for the last Soils 2026 project in the Sierra Nevada, including parts of the Golden Trout and South Sierra Wilderness areas of the Inyo National Forest. Thank you. Andrew, take it away.
Thank you very much, Deb, and I'm happy to be able to share with you all today. I'm gonna try and take over the screen now. Okay, and so today I'm here to talk about the Ecological Site Analytical tool. This is actually a set of tools that are kind of cobbled together from various things that I've been fortunate enough to work on over the last several years, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about it. So, the Ecological Site Analytical tool. A name like this, I think, offers a lot of promise, especially given the amount of interest we have in ecological sites these days. But the first kind of caveat I want to say here is that I'm not an ecological site specialist. So the angle of this presentation is going to perhaps be a little bit different than some of the other recent excellent field note webinars that we've had from our ecological site staff. So the main kind of differentiator I would say here is that I'm making use of our database products, Surgo, Soil Data Access, looking at sort of how our users see these products. The focus of this ecological site analytical tool at this point is not so much on the primary ecological data that are being collected in the sort of basic data comprising those site definitions. And though I'm not an ecological site specialist, I am a soil scientist, and I believe that ecological sites and soils are deeply integrated. And there's a lot of promise in terms of using ecological site concepts to work across the boundaries of historic soil surveys and working towards greater development of our major land resource area concepts. So some of the drivers for this recent work are QC and QA needs within the Southwest Soil Survey region. Over the last year or so, I've served part-time as regional GIS specialist, and in the course of doing QA on projects and in response to requests from spatial and tabular data from our cooperators, these tools have been developed. And so we've been increasingly getting requests for information from folks outside of Soil and Plant Science Division to access ecological site information. And so some of the tools I'm going to discuss here are sort of my response to that and some prototypes for things that I think we can do to improve our products down the line. One kind of unique aspect of my past few years is that I've been really using a lot of R code and R packages as a method for distribution of the sort of business logic of the various things I'm doing. And so this presentation is not going to be any exception to that. I've been involved in the Soil DB R package as maintainer for the last 4 years or so. And in that time, we've added a lot of new features for accessing our soil and ecological site data. So the gist of most of this presentation is talking about different methods for soil and ecological data aggregation, with a focus again on our primary products that we give to the public. So some of the common methods that you're going to encounter for this are the dominant condition or dominant component. And so these are looking at some of the most prevalent within map unit concepts. And also these are usually the way that we kind of cook down those many-to-one relationships that exist within our hierarchical database. And ultimately the goal for this, and the goal of many of our users, is essentially creating thematic maps. They want essentially a one-to-one relationship between our spatial data, be it raster pixels or map unit polygons, relating to our map unit concepts. These dominant condition and dominant component aggregations are easy to explain, and they should be right or accurate most of the time, and a good representation of the majority condition for our map units. These types of aggregation methods are readily available through a variety of different methods. First and foremost would be Web Soil Survey. And so on the right-hand side, I'm showing the Ecological Sites tab in Web Soil Survey that allows you to create dominant ecological site maps, as well as generate tables for map units for ecological sites assigned to all components within map units. And this is a great way to inspect our data, but there are limitations to Web Soil Survey in terms of the spatial extent and the presentation of that tabular data. And so that's sort of where we take it a step further. Soil Data Development Toolbox, a set of tools for ArcMap and ArcPro, are also geared towards doing some of this type of aggregation. And then finally, the SoilDB Soil Database Interface, R package, has many, many options for working with these types of aggregation methods. So I originally titled this slide Problems in ES Aggregation, but really I think these are opportunities. These are ways for us to emphasize the depth and breadth of our data and our products, and be able to respond to the needs of our users, which often are beyond some of the details that we're working with on a day-to-day basis. So some of the opportunities we have for wrangling this ecological site information are folks are interested in extensive areas. So at least major land resource areas or even whole regions. We have had requests for data for the entire country. And, sometimes maybe folks are only interested in a relatively small area, but they want to see the comprehensive data set to sort of understand the context. Furthermore, we have multiple components and in some cases, multiple ecological sites per map unit. This many-to-one relationship requires being a little bit careful about how you do the aggregation and whether you're sort of missing part of the story when you do a dominant condition or a dominant component aggregation. On top of that, we also have different types of ecological classes that are exported to our Sergo product. So it goes beyond just ecological sites. And then finally, and this is really what's been of greatest interest to me, especially in my role as assisting the regional GIS specialist, is sort of understanding the differences between what's populated in the tabular parts of our data versus how that's expressed spatially in our map unit polygon and other spatial products. And so the idea that you're tagging these different site concepts to some sort of spatial extent, but these exist as sort of separate silos that are integrated in our final Sergo product, but you can do a whole lot on the tabular side without really even thinking about the spatial and vice versa. And so this is, an opportunity for us to kind of synthesize these two different components of our data set. So jumping back to SoilDB, this R package has grown in popularity in recent years. We've had over 100,000 downloads through the official CRAN repository. And I really just think that this is a testament to not only internal interest in using these types of tools for wrangling our data, but external folks too. And I hear from folks every week. I'm getting emails from people who are happy about these methods being available for wrangling our data and accessing it. And I think it's really important that we continue to support these types of methods for accessing data. So jumping right into some of the ecological site data aggregation methods available in SoilDB. One of the main workhorse functions that I've put together for this purpose targets the component ecological class table. And so that's the SoilDB get SDA coeco class function. Recently, and in response to the sort of needs that I'm discussing here, I've come up with a method for all condition aggregation. So we already have the typical aggregation methods, dominant condition, dominant component. For numeric properties, you might do weighted averages. In this case, it's doing that many-to-one flattening, but it's retaining more options for downstream thematic mapping. And ultimately, you're creating some sort of attribute table with values that are unique to the map unit key or legend map unit ID or national map unit symbol. So it allows you to easily relate these results to whatever spatial products you might be interested in. And the basic gist of this is a wide format column or a wide format table with many columns where each site condition, ecological site condition, has a prefix, site 1, site 2, site 3, and then various other pieces of information associated with it. But it's all wide, and so each map unit only has one record, which makes it very easy to use in GIS software or other types of tools that might aggregate tabular data. So, for example, what this sort of looks like is a wide format table. So here I only was really able to fit about 2 sites into this table, but if you go through our whole database and I run these routines on the entire country, you will find that there are map units that have many, many distinct ecological sites and components associated with them. So it really allows you to easily kind of drill down into that level of detail while not being overwhelmed with this sort of many-to-one relationship of child table records to their parent table. So here we have sort of 3 different map units that I selected at random, and I thought they illustrated some of the types of things that you see when you start running these types of all condition aggregations. So in the first case, we have the Bresser Loamy Sand map unit, where 100% of that map unit is assigned to the Sandy Plains ecological site. And that includes the dominant and major named component Bresser, but it also includes 2 other components, Old Nest and Bona. And so in this case, this is a pretty straightforward application of dominant condition where dominant condition is actually the entire map unit. Next, we have the Freedom map unit. And so here we actually have two Freedom components that are associated with this first dominant condition site. And so these sites are ordered in decreasing prevalence within the map unit. And we find that both of the Freedom components in this map unit are assigned to this semi-rich wet outwash site. And just sort of as a value-added component to these tables that get generated, we generate links to the edit website. So it's super easy for folks who might be pulling this up in GIS or working with the tabular data to go in and look at what the actual definition of that site is and getting access to that information that our ecologists are working so hard to populate. So here we have two Freedom components, and we'll drill down into this a little bit more in the next slide, that sum to 85% of the map unit. Then we have another 6 minor components which don't have an ecological site assigned. In the third case here, we actually have 2 different ecological sites that are present within the map unit. So we've got the Estacado Loam, where 95% of the map unit and 3 components within that map unit have this deep hardland ecological site. Likewise, or kind of following the pattern that we've seen above, there are other components in the map unit. So here we have the Portales soils, which make up only 5% of the map unit, but they have a distinct ecological site, the Limey Upland ecological site. And so very easily, you can just see in this wide format that you can access the information for both of these ecological sites. And you also can get some inference about what the relative proportion of those things are within the map unit. So the all condition aggregation that I showed you is actually just a special case and sort of a reworking of the basic data that this get SDA co-eco class function targets. And so looking back at that Freedom silt loam and trying to understand why we have 2 components listed under the name Freedom with the same ecological site, we find that this is actually essentially a complex of drainage classes. And so looking at the local phase, 50% of the map unit is poorly drained, and 35% of the map unit is somewhat poorly drained. And so then I guess the inference would be that this ecological site, semi-rich wet outwash, encompasses both poorly drained and somewhat poorly drained soils. And then likewise, some of these other components are not assigned. So it's not entirely clear, how they relate. But, an interesting thing to think about, I think, is, strongly contrasting minors and, their disproportionate role that they might play, even though they may not be extensive. And that hasn't been a major focus of PES so far. The provisional ecological site assignments, which mostly targeted major components. But as we continue to develop our concepts and think about our map unit composition, that'll certainly be something to address. So these SoilDB functions are designed to be really, really generic. And that's something that I've really kind of prided myself on since I've been working on this and developing some of these tools. And the goal is to really provide access to many different forms of the data and make use of the similarities of structure and schema in these databases, but also, giving folks the flexibility to work with whatever they're comfortable with or whatever they might have. So the primary data source that I use is soil data access. And so this allows you to make SQL queries to a centralized server that has essentially a snapshot of all of Surgo. And you can really easily target specific data. So that might be, 1 or 2 soil survey areas of interest, or maybe just a map unit, a single map unit, or a couple related map units. The downsides to this are that you do need an internet connection, so it won't work if you're not connected to the internet or soil data access is down. And then furthermore, you need to work around the limits on total records return. And so you can't really return much more than 100,000 records in most cases, but that doesn't mean you can't sort of break things up into chunks and work around it. But with those things in mind, you can use the various representations of GSurgo. And so I've found that some of the spatially extensive reporting that I've been requested to do for the Southwest region and some of these other areas where folks have requested our data is well served by the GSurgo products. And so recently there's been the Surgo portal tool that's been made available in beta form, and that is a really phenomenal way of presenting our data and making it really easy for folks to query it regardless of what type of software they might be using. So I'd encourage you all to check out that Sergo portal tool if you haven't already. And then furthermore, internally, a lot of times we want to be able to check what our products are going to look like before we actually publish them. And so SoilDB also provides some methods for creating essentially preliminary Sergo SQLite databases based on an ANSYS export. So you could export any of the information that may not yet be published, and you can verify that it's behaving the way that you want the public to see it. Now I'm going to kind of change gears a little bit and talk about some of the details of these different databases and some of the things that I've discovered that I didn't think they were super obvious when I was kind of initially delving into it. And I've tried to develop these routines so that they can work across these different types of variants. So we have the component ecological class table in Sergo, where you have many different ecological classes that are possible. Most of us are thinking about the NRCS forest land or NRCS rangeland sites. In some areas, you also have forage suitability groups. And then some of these different types of class types have a specific reference associated with them. And so this is not just the ecological site description database, but there's a variety of national and local vegetation classification systems which are contained in Sergo. And so just to kind of throw it out there, fiscal year 2024 Sergo has 121 different distinct vegetation class types. So these are groups of codes that are essentially each of their own systems. And some of them are obsolete, but some of them actually contain a lot of information that might be relevant to our partners or relevant to the future development of our ecological sites. And given the focus on PES and getting all of our Sergo major components well correlated to a defensible concept that we can then work with, the main focus so far has been on these forest and rangeland sites. But in theory, all of these routines could be applied to any type of vegetation class that's available in Sergo. And so one thing that I've looked at, just as sort of an internal check, is looking at some of the representative value indicators. So on the NASA side of things, where most of us are working, we actually have multiple tables that are contributing to that Sergo component eco class. So we've got the component ecological site and the component other vegetation class. And then within the component ecological site, we have the representative ecological site column. And I've added the emphasis here, only one ecological site is representative for a component. And this is essentially used during the export process to determine which sites the user is going to see when, for instance, they go to Web Soil Survey and generate one of those maps or tabular reports. With looking at the complexity of these data, not only do you have these sort of tables that allow you to have multiple records and select one as representative, there's also this sort of level of the map unit where you need to deal with these different components that might exist. And so I've been thinking about different methods for compositional summaries. So for instance, maybe you want to know how many sites it takes you to exceed 75 or 80% of a map unit, and however many sites that is. Maybe it's 4, maybe it's just 1. Like maybe you want to know that you're covering some minimal, some baseline proportion of the extent of that map unit. Also, there are instances where you may want to include minor components or exclude them entirely. You may want to include miscellaneous areas or components of specific name and type or exclude them. These are options that are available in this aggregation method. We can do sorting based on site type, the level of detail, alphabetical, or custom ordinal relationships. So for instance, maybe you want it to list the shallow sites first and the deeper sites next. And so it may not depend so much on that component percentage, but rather some inherent relationship between those sites. And that allows you to kind of smooth over some of the subtle variances in composition and look at the commonalities across map units. And so again, here's just a visual of that sort of multiple representative ecological site. Because of the way PES has been implemented, and really actually just historically how this component ecological site table has been managed, which this particular instance way predates PES, we have multiple representative ecological sites checked in this component ecological site table. And this is probably some sort of a relic from the historic rangeland or the California State Range site called Claypan. And so these soils are both assigned, these soils are assigned two different ecological sites with the same name, one associated with MLRA 17 and one associated with 14. In many of these cases, it might be trivial to essentially fix this and say, oh, well, these soils are entirely in 14 or entirely in 17, so we're just going to use one. In other cases, there may be more kind of subtle conceptual differences that might need to be investigated further. Some other types of tabular data checks we can do are comparing year-to-year changes in our Circo products. So we can easily get numbers on how many new assignments were made, over how many acres, or what proportion of MLRAs. Another thing that I've been working on beyond just sort of the nuts and bolts of checking composition and making sure that the various standards for NASAs are followed, we can really start to look at the spatial expression of these concepts. And so ultimately this relies on you choosing some sort of thematic variable of interest. And like I said before, oftentimes that is dominant condition. I mean, that is, sort of going to get you the most bang for your buck if you're going to choose just one variable of interest. But you really could use any thematic variable. And then the idea here is that you would generate some sort of a list or areas of interest to look at, and you would be able to inspect those spatial patterns in the GIS of your choice. And then we can also create different derivative products using these types of aggregate information. And so, as I mentioned, some of the alternate types of themes that I have in mind, the top 4 classes or the top number of classes above some threshold, or some sort of alphabetical sorting or ordinal sorting of those concepts to smooth over variations in composition. And so one of the low-hanging fruit options for this that I've been thinking about, and I think maybe this is a little bit biased by my role in looking at boundaries and the quality assurance of our spatial products. The soil survey area boundaries actually provide kind of a zoomed in approach on sort of what concepts are flowing in and out of the units that we're working on a day-to-day basis in soil survey. And so while we are working on MLRA scale projects, the nuts and bolts of how we're managing the spatial data require us to work within soil survey areas. And looking at the boundaries of those soil survey areas, provides us some sort of a framework for whether something is correct or whether it's suspicious or what have you. And so the premise being that ecological sites should not change abruptly at political boundaries in most cases. I mean, maybe you have certain physiography situations where a county line corresponds to some major feature where you are expecting a difference. But in general, this allows you to at least generate that list of things to sort of follow up. So I see kind of 2 major components to this. In some cases, you might just have what I am calling essentially a spatial mismatch. And it may be that you have 2 sets of ecological sites that are coming together at a soil survey area boundary, and those ecological site concepts are very well defined. There's no issue with the fact that they're both there, but maybe they just don't quite look right cartographically. And so that might be just the basis of, developing a couple new MLRA map units and kind of feathering them together based on the sort of natural expected extent of those things, rather than breaking right at the soil survey area boundary. Another one that I think is pretty interesting for the kind of future work that we need to do for ecological sites are where we have conceptual mismatches. So things that really actually shouldn't maybe be, running right together. Now, there's a few different ways that could go. It might be that these are completely dissimilar sites that are matching up at a boundary, but they might be associated with one another. They may occur in some sort of regular repeating pattern. And so this may need both spatial refinement and refinement of ecological sites. And either way, these are things to generate future projects for MLRA offices, ecological projects, and traditional soil survey update projects. And so the process that I'm using for checking these soil survey area boundaries is essentially, I call it common soil lines in reverse. So this is a check that we all probably perform in the process of finishing our soil survey data, or actually regularly as we're doing any sort of digitization. We're checking to make sure that we don't make splits and have polygons adjacent to each other that have the same symbol. And so again, in this case, we might choose a thematic variable that's not necessarily the map unit symbol, but rather the dominant condition ecological site, or some aggregation of all the conditions that exist within a map unit. And then you can break the boundaries of the soil survey areas into line segments that correspond to those map unit polygon extents, and then tabulate matches or mismatches based on that thematic variable. And there's like a few different ways you can quantify that, either total counts, the associated map unit acres, or the shared and mismatched perimeter in aggregate. So you sum up the lengths of those line segments, and you can very quickly, see how often a particular concept is adjoining another one. And then again, this could be used to identify future projects. And so just sort of a quick visualization of what that might look like. And I've been developing some tools that are going to make this, I think, a little bit easier to kind of step through some of the differences. You can generate this for soil survey areas or collections of soil survey areas. So here I'm showing the Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park extent, and the legend is basically showing what the site concept coming out of the soil survey area is all the way along the boundary. And again, this isn't necessarily an answer to figuring out the natural MLRA extent, but it is sort of working at the scale of where we're making our spatial updates to our products. And therefore, it's kind of an important piece of the information, although maybe not the whole story. And so I'm going to zoom in on just one line segment of interest, just to kind of show what's happening at a more granular level. So I've put a yellow box around where we're going to zoom into. And so here we're at the summit of Diamond Peak on the eastern flank of the Sierra Nevada. And I'm just showing the map unit symbol as the thematic variable here, just so I can illustrate that there are instances where you may have map units that don't match exactly perfectly. So in this case, the boundary of the Sequoia and Kings Canyon project pretty much corresponds with the crest of this mountain. And as you switch, you've got aspect and different amounts of rock outcrop and miscellaneous areas that are basically driving which map unit symbols are being used. So this is an instance where we actually have pushed out the concepts from the soil survey area, and it's all been well correlated, but there are mismatches here. And so it's something that you could go in and check and see if it's portraying what you want. And so again, these actually wind up looking a lot more similar when you drop out some of the miscellaneous areas. And you find that actually the shared ecological sites across these boundaries are similar. And so I want folks to be able to think about and use these tools. And so much of this stuff is already available in the SoilDB R package, which is providing those sort of basic query utilities for a variety of different data sources. I've also been working on developing what I've called the ESAT R package, which is some of these ES specific aggregation methods and spatial methods that don't really quite fit in the SoilDB package and are a little bit bleeding edge at this point. I really think that this code or logic belongs somewhere else. And so that is why while I've been developing this as a prototype, I think we can actually provide this through a much easier method than using an R package, perhaps. And so that's what I'll talk about next, where I think we can go. So on one hand, I think that this stuff needs to be easier for our users to get right off the bat when they download a GCirco product. And so we already have a value-added table with essentially ready-to-map attributes, many of which are weighted average, but some of them are categorical, that are, again, that one-to-one relationship between your map unit keys and some properties of interest. And I think we just need to have easier access to this type of ecological site composition in our products. And I'm not sure what the best way to do that is, but I have recently come up with what I've called the ES polygon. And so this is essentially just a duplication of the map unit polygon, only instead of the sort of bare bones attribute table, which is just your map unit symbols and area symbols and map unit keys. It includes some other, key map unit identifying information like the name and national map unit symbol, but then also these sort of wide format representations of the ecological site information. And so this is just something that makes the ecological site data the forefront of what we're presenting, and makes that readily available to users. It's not something that will become probably part of the Surgo data model per se, but it's definitely something that I think needs to be more accessible than it currently is. And so, providing some sort of a value-added table in Surgo would be one way to do that, which would be then easy to join up to your map unit polygons. And so the current R prototypes for generating this stuff easily could be converted to Python, JavaScript, SQL, whatever other platform we might need to deliver this. And so thinking about, say, the future of the edit database, or some of the stuff that we may be able to do with the Dynamic Soils Hub or what have you, there may be ways to essentially generate these things on the fly as our products are updated and have them kind of sit very, very close, but maybe not a key part of the actual Surgo schema. And I think that's an important distinction, because ultimately all this stuff is just derived from the publicly available data. It's not really unique, it's sort of just a different visualization of it. And then another thing that takes this a step further, and I think really directly feeds into what the site concepts are, is keeping this type of aggregation in mind when you're actually developing aggregate numeric property ranges for sites. And so essentially, performing, say, weighted average aggregation of just the components assigned to one particular site within a map unit, instead of a weighted average over all things in the map unit, and then using that to develop your models or ranges. And the real issue with especially our more general mapping is that you can have strongly contrasting components within a map unit. And so you have that spatial extent of that map unit sort of folded in with the variation of however many sites you might have in there. And so some way to sort of parse out at a finer level of detail with a focus on the ecological site would allow us to generate some of the ranges we might need to further refine our ecological sites. And then finally, I've experimented a bit with ArcGIS Online web service for delivering this information. And that was, I think, a really, really great way to make folks make this information available to people. And so the tabular data or even the spatial data could be delivered through a method like that. And maybe ArcGIS Online would not be the best way, but there are other ways that we could do it. For instance, providing that mentioned value-added table through soil data access, or some other method that will make this data really easy for folks to query based on soil survey area or MLRA or ecological site or map unit. And so those are some of the things that I hope that we could do more of in the future. If you have any questions about what I've mentioned, you can reach out to me anytime. I've also developed a number of derivative products that are essentially ready for folks to dig into and start looking at. And so for fiscal year 2023 and 2024, I have these wide format ecological site tables for the whole country. And again, that's the focusing on the NRCS rangeland and forestland sites, but we actually can generate them for other things. So if you're interested in forage suitability groups, we could talk about that, and I could show you how to get it. And then on top of that, I've gone out and looked at some of the composition, looking at some of those multiple RV and other types of missing component percentage type inconsistencies. And I've generated some reports by region and MLRA Soil Survey Office. So if this is something you want to kind of drill down into, that might be a great place to start. And I'd be happy to share that with you on request. And with that, thank you so much for your attention. You can scan this QR code and connect with us in the future, or find us on Twitter. I would be happy to take any questions now.
Hi, Andrew. That was great. We do have one question, and it is, I know that there was an API of some kind developed for EDIT. It seems like the biggest disconnect in ESD aggregation analysis is connecting data in EDIT to Sergo. Has there been any effort to aggregate an API call to EDIT with a query from Sergo?
So there is an API for EDIT, and I agree that there is a disconnect there. I think the issue is that ingesting data into EDIT is something that we don't have a whole lot of control on the SPSD side. So I hope that the future kind of incarnations of EDIT will allow us to perform more types of operations that are getting at what you're describing. I think right now the EDIT API, which actually there's several functions in the SoilDB package that access the EDIT API, you're able to get some of the information out there, but it's not necessarily Sergo derived, and there are limitations with just what that API currently allows you to do. But I think that's ultimately a great suggestion and something that needs to be thought about more as we continue to refine these tools.
We also have another question. Are there any hopes to build a specific Shiny app for this, or is this above what a Shiny app would be useful for?
A Shiny app would be a great way to, as one alternative of essentially visualizing this kind of complicated tabular and spatial data. And I, unfortunately, haven't come up with a whole lot of really pretty visualizations, but my thought with some of the maps that I showed with the spatial analysis is that you essentially could embed something like that into a Shiny app and set it up so that you could essentially chunk through each of those line segments and look at boundaries, or chunk through ecological sites and look at their extents, or what have you. And so I would love to see that as something that gets developed in the future. At this point, I haven't done it because, well, the data sets that I'm working with are kind of large. And so running a Shiny app locally is kind of a nice way to do it if you've got all that data downloaded, but it's not necessarily something that's super easy to deploy without having these data available in some sort of a web service or something like that. And I think that the benefit would be essentially pre-calculating a lot of this stuff and putting it onto some sort of a web service, and then having the Shiny app hit that so that you could do the processing very, very quickly. And given that the actual public products are only updated once a year in general, it allows a lot of opportunity for essentially pre-computing these results and then making them easy for folks to inspect. And then you might still have a local app that you would be able to run with your preliminary data, or your work in progress spatial combined with your tabular. And so I would say it's not beyond what a Shiny app would be used for, but I haven't developed it yet. And I would be happy if someone else was interested in doing that.
Could you add the API for EDIT here?
I'm not sure I understand the question entirely, but the EDIT API could be used to add additional information to any of these results. So in that sense, yeah, you could, once you have a site code, you could then, instead of just generating that URL, you might then generate some requests to the EDIT API to pull some of the additional information. That certainly can be done.
I'm sorry. There was also a comment that we are pushing for more integration between EDIT and Sergo data in NRCS. That is the direction where we want to head.
That's
And
wonderful.
I think that does it for as far as questions. There's no more rolling in.
Thanks so much, Sarah. And everybody who asked questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Appreciate it. Folks, reach out to him if you have any other questions or conversations. Reminder, the next webinar. So thanks, everyone. Appreciate your time.